that, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Mya Dosch. She's an associate professor of art, art of the Americas here at Sac State. She teaches courses on Latin American art, race and representation, and public art in the Americas. Her work creating 1968 art, architecture, and the afterlives of the Mexican student movement sounds fascinating. And that received the 2019 Association for Latin American Art Biennial Dissertation Award. Mya has published in Future Interior, Sculpture Journal, and Teachable Moments. And of course, she also leads, which maybe we get to participate in this one day. She leads summer study abroad trips to Mexico. And when she's not off in Mexico, this is her second year leading an art walk for us. It was wonderful for those of you who attended. It was absolutely wonderful. And so now it's my pleasure to bring Mya up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Deborah. So thank you to all of you who joined me on the art walk before. Now you get to rest in the cool air. And I am a public art specialist. So I'm glad that some of you got to see some of the public art on campus that you might not have noticed before. But I also think a lot about muralism in Mexico. So I'm excited to share some of that with you today. Thank you, Chris. So you might have heard a lot about Mexican muralism, but today I hope you get to learn a little bit deeper about the different artists that were part of the Mexican muralist moment. Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So I'm just curious, what images come to mind when you think of Mexican muralism? You can just yell them out. I'll repeat them for folks on Zoom, but calla lilies. So yeah, we think of Diego Rivera with those calla lily vendor images. Laborers. So we think of the working class being represented, being celebrated in Mexican art. Yeah. Revolution. So we think about the Mexican Revolution and people kind of rising up against this corrupt government of Mexico at the time. Yeah, so Aztecs, we think about the indigenous kind of heritage of Mexico being represented in murals. Snakes and butterflies, yeah, so connected back to their importance in Mesoamerican cultures. Workers and factories, yeah, so not just agricultural workers, but also factory workers coming together. So one of the things that I hope we do today is, yes, we'll see some of these things. We'll see workers, we'll see references to Aztec art, but I also hope we complicate your idea of what Mexican muralism is, because often the Mexican muralists are grouped together, but they had very different political ideas. They had very different artistic styles. So I'm going to give you a little taste of each one of the big three Mexican muralists, so you can start to see some of the differences in that movement instead of just lumping them all together. So in order to understand Mexican muralism, you have to understand a little bit about art before Mexican muralism and what happened during the revolution. So we'll look a little bit at that, and then we'll talk about the big three muralists. So Diego Rivera, José Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Siqueiros. And then I'll leave some time for questions at the end. But one thing I want you to be thinking about as I introduce you to these three major muralists is, which muralist do you think follows the best revolutionary path? Because all three of these muralists were trying to support the Mexican Revolution, this new idea of Mexico, but they disagreed on how to do it. And in fact, they were actively fighting with each other about who's the most revolutionary. So this is an op-ed that Siqueiros wrote, where he's basically slamming Rivera for being too touristy, not revolutionary enough. And in fact, those two muralists, Rivera and Siqueiros, get into such public debates that at one of them, Rivera brings a pistol and is swinging his pistol around while they're fighting about art and what art should be. So as we go, I want you to think, which would you pick as the most revolutionary? Which one do you think picks or takes the most revolutionary path? because that is what the muralists themselves were fighting about. All right. Now everyone on Zoom and in person can see. So we have to know a little bit about what politics and art were like before the revolution in order to understand the murals after the revolution. So before the revolution is the period in Mexico known as the Porfiriato, which is the period in which Mexico was ruled by this man, Porfirio Diaz, who functioned as a dictator because there were not free elections or open elections in Mexico at the time. So he rules for a very long time. And I think this portrait of Diaz can tell us a lot about what his government was like. So a few things, yeah, I heard someone say, I don't think he has enough medals. So yes, Porfirio Diaz is a very decorated military general in Mexico. He's actually the person that you can thank for the holiday Cinco de Mayo, because he was the one who led Mexican troops in the Battle of Puebla on May 5th to defeat the French. So he was a very important military general. He earned some of those medals. But he also was really looking out for the most elite in Mexico. So he was a government that was for those wealthy elites in Mexico City and for the wealthy landowners in other parts of the country. That's who he was talking to. That's who was giving him his power. That's the only people who had a voice in his government. And he was also very interested in making Mexico more like Europe. So he wanted to make Mexico City look more like Paris, which was the kind of supreme example of a beautiful cosmopolitan city at the time. And not only does he want to make Mexico City look more European, he also even tries to make himself look more European. So he does have some indigenous ancestry. He's from Oaxaca, a very indigenous, predominantly indigenous state in Mexico. But on photographs, he sometimes has them retouch the negatives to make his face look whiter, to make him look more European. So before the Mexican Revolution, we have this idea that being European is the way of the future for Mexico. After the revolution, we'll see that change. And we start to see more pride in indigenous heritage, unlike what Porfirio Diaz is doing. So what kind of art is he commissioning? Is he supporting? He's supporting art in a European style. So things like these large history paintings on canvas that show Mexican history, but from a very European lens. So here we see this indigenous history, but with the white European as the kind of savior or as the powerful figure in the painting. And in Mexico City, he's installing things to make Mexico City look more like Paris. So these grand sculptures in the kind of Beaux Arts French style on the boulevards in Mexico City. Now, this is the flip side of Porfirio Diaz's government. It's that 95% of the land is owned by 5% of the population. So if you are a farmer in Mexico, it is likely that you're working and most of your profits and most of your labor are going to that hacienda owner, the person who lives in this fancy house who's benefiting from your labor. And Porfirio Diaz is also really helping foreign companies and foreign countries. So foreign companies control 2/3 of Mexico's wealth. Mines, railroad companies are all making major profits, and the Mexican people are not seeing those profits. So you get a sense of why the revolution might have been brewing here. And so the Mexican Revolution breaks out in 1910. And this is basically a 10-year civil war over the future of Mexico's government. Now, there are whole classes at Sacramento State just about all of the complicated things that happen in the Mexican Revolution. So I'm not going to go into very much detail. I just want to mention a few points. First of all, it did not begin as this kind of spontaneous popular uprising or this kind of grassroots revolution that we often think of when we think of the Mexican Revolution. It actually started because this guy, Francisco Madero, wanted to run for president and couldn't because there weren't fair elections. So he and a number of his supporters started this uprising to try to have fair elections. And then it became a broader revolution. And so some of the famous names that you might have heard from the Mexican Revolution, Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, some of them, like Madero and Villa, were actually wealthy men themselves. They were regional elites, but they weren't being heard by Porfirio Diaz. So they were frustrated, and they had these large groups of followers that started to fight for a different government in Mexico. Emiliano Zapata was really the exception, and that's why Zapata's name has become so important in Mexico, why the Zapatista movement in the 1990s and ongoing in Mexico is named after him, because he was a rural farm worker leader. And he was fighting for this slogan of tierra y libertad, or land and freedom. This idea that the farmers who work the land should make the profits and should be able to own their own land, not just those few wealthy landowners. Now, I'm going to show you an image that includes dead bodies. This is one of the images that circulated internationally about the Mexican Revolution. So the Mexican Revolution finally ends. Porfirio Diaz, his government and his governmental model is out. But Mexico has just been through this 10-year civil war. And it's estimated that between 1 and 1.5 million Mexicans died during that period. And this is the view of Mexico both internally and abroad. So here in the United States, if you went to a movie theater at that time during the revolution, the newsreel before the film would be a recreation of some of the battles of the Mexican Revolution. So people from outside were watching and seeing all this violence in Mexico. And Mexico really had a kind of PR issue. How do we rebrand that we're new, we're different? Something has changed from before the revolution, that this was worth it. And so they had to show that both they were different from Porfirio Diaz, they were different from the previous government, but they were also no longer in civil war. It was no longer this violent period of civil war. And that is where Diego Rivera and the Mexican Muralists come in, is to try to show a new face of Mexico, both to the Mexican people and to people like us in the United States. So Diego Rivera is actually not even in Mexico during the revolution. He's studying art at some of the major art centers in Europe. So he's in Madrid and Paris. After the revolution, he gets a scholarship to study mural painting in Italy. So he's actually studying Renaissance murals to try to bring that knowledge back. And so in 1921, after the end of the revolution, he returns to Mexico and starts doing works for the Mexican government. Diego Rivera is a very ambitious artist. So I'm just going to show you one panel of the over 100 mural panels that he does for the Ministry of Public Education building. This is a major government building. It was a government building during the Porfiriato, but now they want to show that something has changed. So they're going to show that by changing the way the building looks, changing the murals. So he does these images on 2 different patios, 3 different stories of this building to try to kind of reclaim it and show that things have changed. So this is the panel that I want to look at with you today from that massive 100 panel or over 100 panel project. And this is his image called The Mechanization of the Country. And it's actually on a stairway. So as you're walking up the stairs, you see this mural. What's Rivera's view of Mexico after the revolution? How is he showing that Mexico is different? Mexico has changed. This is a new government in this building. What do you notice? What details stand out to you here? And I'll repeat them for the Zoom audience. Yeah, Chris. Excellent. Yeah. So at the top of the stairway, as you're moving up, moving toward the future, we have these three figures that Chris mentioned. And Chris said that it looks like a soldier and maybe a worker. Yeah, that's actually, let's see if I can get to that. The Revolutionary Trinity is what this group of three men is often called. So if you think about Mexican art and Mexican history, there's a lot of Catholic art in Mexico. That's what Mexican populations would be familiar with, the idea of the Catholic Trinity of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And here, Rivera says, okay, we know this Trinity idea. Let's make it into a revolutionary Trinity. It's secular, working class Trinity. So his Trinity is the foot soldier, not the general, but the everyday soldier, the rural farmer in his sombrero and his sandals, and then on the right in the overalls is the urban factory worker, who folks mentioned. And notice how they're unified. We see his hand, the farmer's hand on the soldier's shoulder, or how these two workers are clasping hands. This idea that they're no longer fighting against each other, but they're coming together in the New Mexico. So yeah, one of the big messages is that these working people are now calling the shots, are now the leaders of Mexico going forward. Let's go. And that goes along with this idea of social realism. So that we're no longer painting just the elites, just the leaders of Mexico, but that the everyday life of working class people is valuable, deserves to be painted enormously on a government building wall. What else do you notice? What other? Oops, sorry. Here. Yes, so the airplane that we see up here that Deborah mentioned. So part of the New Mexico is this idea that technology is going to make rural farmers' lives better. So we see here the plane, the hydroelectric dam, we see power lines, and this detail in the middle, we see the farmer, but he's no longer doing this backbreaking manual labor, he's driving the tractor. This idea that the government is going to invest in those farmers to make their lives easier. Now, is the government actually doing this in practice in 1926? That's a whole other conversation. But Rivera is making it look real good for farmers in this image. Yeah, that's very interesting. That someone in the room just pointed out that the woman is the center of the whole composition. Yeah, so we have these three men on the right who are kind of the leaders of the future, the Revolutionary Trinity. We have these three men on the left. What's up with them? I'll get back to the woman in a minute, but they're being struck down by this figure that's wrapped in this red cloak. And I almost think of her as like a revolutionary angel. Again, Rivera says people in Mexico understand Catholic symbolism, so we'll say that this is like an angel, but she's striking down the old ways. So this figure is supposed to represent the power of the church, so a Catholic priest. And this figure is supposed to represent one of those workers on a hacienda that would have forced the farmers to keep laboring, like a hacienda overseer. And you can see that she's struck him down, she's broken his sword into three pieces. So this is like the Mexico of the past on the left side. And the workers are the Mexico of the future, but then the woman is in the middle. She's working the hardest. Yes, I agree. She's the one who doesn't have any technology or any solidarity. And I think that sometimes women in Rivera's murals are used as symbols, but not seen as like part of the future, part of the community. So that's a good point. She's actually, though, holding, oops. So what she's holding, I don't have my slide from it right now, but she's holding both corn, which is the ancestral crop of Mesoamerica, but then on her lap, there's also wheat, which at the time was seen as the kind of crop of the future. Again, in a very Eurocentric model, but Rivera is showing here that Mexico's staying true to its tradition of corn, but also investing in wheat production. And the woman is actually designed to look like an Aztec sculpture of Xilonen, who was the goddess of new corn, of corn production. So he's also saying we're connected to our pre-Columbian or our Mesoamerican roots with that woman figure. Yeah, so I think that's a really good point. So someone in the room here said that she represents fertility. So yeah, she's most closely connected to agriculture. She's actually touching the corn and the wheat. So yeah, that long connection between women and fertility, and also the Virgin Mary here. Oh yes, thank you. The thing down at the bottom. So right here. Yeah, so that's another one of these three figures. I've never gotten a good answer of what he's holding. He's holding this bundle of something, but I don't know what that bundle is. So yeah, I don't know exactly. It's a very good question. But yeah, I'm not sure what he's supposed to be holding. Any other questions about this piece? So here we see Mexico leaving the wealthy elites behind. And as you walk up the stairs, you're literally walking up towards these three figures that represent the future, which I think is a really brilliant decision by Diego Rivera. He's thinking about, okay, as these education workers are walking upstairs, I want them to feel like they're being enlightened, like they're going toward the future. He's not thinking about this just as a painting, he's thinking about it as a painting in a building and how you're going to see that on the stairway. Let's keep going here. So why make murals? Why wouldn't Rivera just do a bunch of paintings on canvas here or sculptures for this public building? There's a lot of answers to this question. One of them is that all that state art that Porfirio Diaz was commissioning and before the revolution was inspired by French styles, trying to make Mexico look like Paris. And murals, on the other hand, were seen as this uniquely Mexican art form. Because at this same time in the 1920s, places like Teotihuacan, the ancient pre-Columbian city outside of Mexico City, were being explored by archaeologists, and they were uncovering things like these incredible murals. So the Mexican government and Diego Rivera himself said, murals are Mexican. We no longer need to look to France for our models. We can look to our indigenous ancestors as models. Excellent. Yeah, so someone in the room here for folks on Zoom was just saying that they're not an elitist art form, that they can be for everyone, that anyone can see this. Yeah, so when Diego Rivera paints those calla lilies on canvas and sells them for big money to US collectors, those aren't going to be seen by the people that he's representing. They're not going to be seen by the soldiers, the factory workers, the farmers. But the idea was that these public murals in government buildings could be for everyone. Now, in reality, are rural farmers coming to Mexico City and going to the Ministry of Education building? No, it's like mainly bureaucrats that are seeing these murals. But I agree that it's much more accessible than something that was sold on the private market and goes into their home. The one that I looked at, the Rivera example is in Mexico City. Yeah, all of the examples we'll look at today are in Mexico City. And another reason to choose murals is that when you paint a mural using fresco, you're actually painting on the wet plaster of the wall. So as soon as that plaster hardens, your mural is part of the wall. So if you want to destroy a mural on fresco, you have to literally chip it away at the wall. So they're a relatively permanent mural form. Now, frescoes have been destroyed, so it's not a perfect model, but by using fresco, the government is saying, like, this is becoming part of the fabric of these buildings. This is part of Mexico. Fresco is also very difficult because what you're seeing at the top is what's known as the jornada, or the what you can finish in one day. So it's a muralist has to plan, like, okay, I can do this much of this mural today, because if you get too much wet plaster and then you don't paint on that plaster before it dries, you're out of luck. You're gonna have to chip that part of the painting off, start fresh. So it's a very delicate and very complex artistic method. You have to know, and you have to work with a lot of other artists who will have your wet plaster applied so that you can be ready to hit the ground running as a painter. And murals, we kind of already touched on this with the wonderful point about how they're elite, but murals were also seen as a working class art form because you had to work with that team. You had to have the guy grinding your paints, you had to have the guy getting your plaster ready, you had to be on scaffolding like a construction worker. So this is actually a Rivera mural from San Francisco, which is a mural about making murals. So this is Rivera painting himself on the scaffolding, wearing blue jeans like the other workers to create this mural of a worker. So it's a very different art form, again, not as elite as previous art forms. That brings us to muralist number 2. So Jose Clemente Orozco is also working at this same time in Mexico. And he actually was in Mexico during the revolution. So he worked as a political cartoonist during the revolution, critiquing some of the revolutionary factions as well, and also following the troops. So he really saw some of the bloodshed of the Mexican Revolution, and it gave him a different approach to his artwork. I also just want to note that something that's not talked about very often with Orozco is that he's actually an artist with a disability. So he had lost one of his hands due to gangrene after a fireworks accident in 1904. So he's doing all these murals using only his one hand as well. Now, Orozco, this is what he said about revolutions. He said, "I do not trust revolutions or glorify them because I had witnessed too much butchery. Only a fool like Rivera, who was in France during the Mexican Revolution, can carry on about revolution." So you start to see some of the tensions between these guys, that these muralists are often grouped together as if they all agreed with each other, but it was actually quite tense. And you will see that Orozco takes a very different approach than Rivera to the revolution. So here's his painting of the revolutionary trinity: the soldier, farm worker, and the factory worker. This is done in the most elite prep school in Mexico City, the school that Frida Kahlo actually attends as a student. Orozco was not asked back to do many more government commissions, as you might be able to tell. So if we compare Orozco to Diego Rivera's mural that we were just looking at, and I'm going to zoom in just on the Revolutionary Trinity section, what are some of the things that Orozco is doing differently here? Yeah, they're suffering, they're threatening are some of the things that I hear. Yeah, instead of holding hands or having their arms around the shoulders of their companions, here, the soldier is this V shape. I think is a really brilliant compositional choice by Orozco. It's almost like the soldier has become this wedge. So instead of united, they're actually being pushed apart. They're divided. Also, we see that they seem to have injuries. So Orozco is representing some of the pain and the violence of the revolution through bodily injuries here. So we see that this figure looks like he might be a double amputee. His eyes or his face also look like he may be blinded here. So we see some of the pain of the revolution. Absolutely. Yeah. So someone here in the room, can I get your name? Thank you, Gloria. So Gloria just said that the colors are much more subdued. Rivera is celebrating the revolution. Orozco is showing this darker side of the revolution. So the colors are more muted too. Yeah, excellent, Gloria. He also shows this figure, all three figures are blinded here. This figure seems to be blinded because he's praying and kind of has his hands in front of his face, so he can't see past his hands. And then the soldier is actually blinded by this flag of revolution. So the whole idea of revolution has blinded him and made him violent, but he's using this violence without any vision. And we have his incredibly kind of muscular arm, very beefy soldier figure coming between the other two figures. So Orozco has very different political views than Rivera. Rivera is a communist, a member of the Communist Party. Orozco is an anarcho-syndicalist. So he's an anarchist and mistrusts all authority and government. So he believes that all power will eventually corrupt. So he doesn't have that optimistic view of the future government after the revolution. He says, that government is going to corrupt as well. So we definitely see that in this artwork, that even the revolutionaries can become blind with their power too. And so his hope, or what anarcho-syndicalists at the time believed, was in this idea of egalitarian worker control and abolishing governments. Again, Orozco does not get many more commissions from the Mexican government after the National Preparatory School Commission. And we also see references to earlier revolutions here. So it's not just about the Mexican Revolution, but you can see that the shape that revolutionary red flag makes is very similar to the shape of the French Revolutionary hat, these kind of red stocking caps that the French revolutionaries are kind of iconic of that era. So he's saying that, even historic revolutions can be corrupted. So he's connecting the Mexican Revolution to French history as well. Any questions about this piece? Yes. Yeah, excellent. Can I get your name too? Theo. So Theo just said that the soldier doesn't have a face and so he's not accountable. Yeah, so he's wielding all this power, this strength. He has this very prominent gun, but he's not accountable to anyone. And he's clearly not connected to the other two figures there. So he's not working for the community, he's maybe working just for himself. And that would be Orozco's view, is that, that soldier who gains power would eventually just use it for himself instead of for the good of his fellows. Yeah, what else? Good question. Can I get your name too? Dallas? Thank you. So what's the difference in the years? That's because he's doing this whole series at the National Preparatory School. Again, I'm only showing you one panel. And he picks up and kind of takes other jobs, comes back. So this is something that he started, this project, in 1923-24, and then finishes it in 1926. And actually his artworks change quite a bit because he's learning. He's changing his ideas as he goes. Yeah, really good question, Dallas. And actually some of this, if you can imagine, this is like the most elite prep school in Mexico City. Some of his works get graffitied by the students because they're like, you painted this really depressing view of the revolution in our school. Some of them are not fans of this work, but it still does exist today, so you can still visit it. That building is no longer a prep school, it's now a museum. You can go visit. Yeah, what else? He does do other murals. Yeah, so the question was, does he do other murals after this? He actually does a mural at Dartmouth College here in the US. He does other murals. here in the United States, at the New School as well in New York City. Yeah, the Dartmouth College mural is in their library, and it shows this giant skeleton wearing like an academic regalia, like the regalia that I wear to graduation as a professor, giving birth to this skeleton of knowledge. And so I always think, man, if I were a student at Dartmouth, would that make me want to study? So I could be a skeleton professor too. So yes, he does get other commissions, but they're often outside of Mexico or outside of the government. Yeah, really good question. Thank you. All right, let's move on to David Alfaro Siqueiros, the youngest of the muralists. And he actually fought in the revolution for one of the factions under Carranza in the Mexican Revolution. He went to a major art school in Mexico City, but he actually led a revolt against the art school's teachings at age 15. So you get a sense that he was pushing back from a very young age. So he enlisted in the revolution at age 18, and he worked on a revolutionary newspaper also as a correspondent. And after the war, he did go to Europe to study art, and he overlapped with Rivera. They worked together there briefly, and then they also split apart and took different routes. So I want to show you something a little different. We've been looking at a lot of murals, but they're also making other types of art. And this is an artwork that was made for El Machete, or the Machete. See? The newspaper of the Mexican Communist Party at the time. And Siqueiros, like Rivera, was involved in the Communist Party, although in different factions at different times. So this is his woodcut print for that Communist Party newspaper. So what do we see here? Same theme, the Revolutionary Trinity. We see the soldier in the middle. We see the farmer here and the urban worker in his overalls there. He's doing this using a woodcut process, which is something that was seen as very uniquely Mexican, or seen as a kind of Mexican art form because of the work of Jose Guadalupe Posada. So if you've seen Posada's woodcuts, he's a very iconic Mexican artist. And so the woodcut process, they would take the block of wood, use these burins or these tools to cut away, and then ink that block. The ink only stays on the raised parts, not the parts that have been cut away. And then you can stamp that onto a piece of paper, run it through a press. And that's one of the reasons that woodcut was so good for the newspaper. You could make many, many copies of this image and then distribute it around Mexico City. So in some ways, Siqueiros is saying that putting my art in this newspaper is maybe more accessible than putting it in a government building, because it's going to be distributed around Mexico City. Now, we already talked about a little bit about why he might be interested in making woodcuts, but I do just want to talk about how he's showing the Trinity. So he's showing them as quite muscular, very united by these strong kind of handhold in the front. And he's also showing that it's not just those three, but they have this whole crew behind them. So the sense of the power of all the Mexican working class, I think, is conveyed in this woodcut. But I also want to show you one of his murals. So we give him a moment for muralism as well. This mural is often credited only to Siqueiros, but he worked with many other artists. His idea was that if we're going to do revolutionary art form, it shouldn't just be about my one ego. It should be about teamwork. So he's working with the Spanish artist Josep Renau and with other artists on this design. Unfortunately, because Siqueiros is the biggest name, they're often left out. So, but he is working collaboratively on this mural. This is called Portrait of the Bourgeoisie here. And this is not in a government building, as you might imagine. Although Rivera is also critiquing the wealthy in government buildings. So It was not impossible to do that in Mexico at the time. This is actually done in a union hall. This is a working union building for the National Electricians Union in Mexico City. Now, when I first learned about this mural when I was in college, I was like, wow, that's so impressive. This must be enormous. Then I went to Mexico City when I was in grad school and visited the Electricians Union, and this is what I saw. It's a pretty humble stairway, like in any kind of office building. But what I did see that I loved is that this is an active office building to this day. So when you're there looking at the mural, there are workers coming and going between offices, saying hi. It's just part of their everyday experience of the building. And I think it also shows Siqueiros' skill that he made this tiny staircase look expansive, almost like he exploded this tiny space by using optical illusions. So this artwork shows the battle between the forces represented on the far right side of the wall. So, excuse me, from the far left side of the wall with those on the far right. So here we can see the forces on one side and the other. On the left side, we have this image of this parrot figure who's kind of connected like almost like a jack in the box to these cogs or to this machine. And notice that this dictator is supposed to be moving his arms. So he's using these green lines, these swoops, to make it look like the parrot is moving, is talking. This is supposed to represent the rise of fascism in Europe and these dictators or fascist leaders. Siqueiros actually goes to Spain and fights in the anti-fascist forces against in the Spanish Civil War. So he's very, very familiar and very, very invested in this fight against dictatorship and fascism at the time. Then on the other side, our kind of little glimmer of hope in this mural is we see this working class soldier in his white shirt kind of bursting in, trying to resist the fascist forces of destruction. And in the middle of the mural, we see this. So we see these figures. Who do you think these are? We have a trinity, but this is not the working class trinity. This is three figures representing the bourgeoisie, the very wealthy capitalists. They're wearing their shiny shoes and their tuxedos and their gas masks. And on the other side, we see military generals. And what's happening here is at the bottom of the stairway, we see these faces of people being sucked into this machine. So they're being sucked into this machine of capitalism, and money is being churned out, but that money is landing at the feet of these other figures. So again, this idea that the working people are being exploited as cogs in this system. The dictators are just parroting or part of that system. And who's actually making the money are these 6 men in the system. This is not what the Electricians Union expected. When they commissioned the mural, they said, we want you to celebrate electricity as the future of Mexico. And so they got a tiny bit of that on the ceiling. So if you look up in the stairwell, you see these amazing smokestacks and also electrical poles. It does really look like you're looking upwards into the sky. So he's fooled your eye to make it look like the ceiling is much taller than it actually is. But all of this fighting fascism message, that was not what the electricians initially wanted. That's what Siqueiros believed in. Now, he's using a lot of industrial techniques too. He says, I don't just want to use old fresco methods like Rivera did. If I'm going to paint for the workers, I should use working class tools. So he's using things like projectors, take images from Life magazine and other major photographic magazines at the time, and project them onto the walls. So things like the smokestacks. He would have used a projector just like on the Sacramento mural that those of you on the public art tour saw, and then outlining or tracing those images onto the wall. He's also using spray paint guns, which today spray paint is a very commonly used in street art. At the time, spray paint was used in things like automobile factories, airplane factories. So he's taking this kind of factory spray paint and the kind of paint that were used in those factories and using it on this mural. So here you see, this is not a spray paint can. It looks kind of like a Ghostbusters backpack. That was the spray paint gun that he was using. But he's also using stencils. So in the sections of the mural here where we see all these fascist soldiers marching in lockstep, it's actually using stencils to make them look exactly uniform there. So he's really being very experimental in his painting techniques. And this is a fun art history fact that not many people realize. So when here in US art history, Jackson Pollock is often held up as like one of the most experimental, maybe misunderstood also, artists of the 20th century. Jackson Pollock actually learned from Siqueiros. So Siqueiros was based in New York City at the time and had what he called the Siqueiros Experimental Workshop, where he was teaching artists to think differently, to use materials differently. And so here we see an image of Siqueiros on the left and Jackson Pollock on the right together in 1936. And this is one of Siqueiros' images or paintings from that time, where he's experimenting with splashing painting, globbing painting, dripping painting, using spray paint, using stencils. So often in US art history, they teach Jackson Pollock as if, oh, he came up with this new thing on his own. He was actually learning from Mexican artists. He was experimenting alongside Siqueiros. And so Siqueiros had this idea of controlled accidents, that this piece, the painting I'm showing you, which is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, he's trying to convey the chaos of the conquest of Mexico. And he says, how better to do that than through these splashing paint, layering paint, making it look kind of like a controlled accident here. So there we see the connection with US art history as well. And one other thing that Siqueiros was thinking about here, and Josep Renau, his collaborator, this is one of his drawings, is that when you look at a mural, it's not like when you look at a painting where you stand in front of it, kind of look at it straight on. You're actually moving through the space. So this drawing shows how he wanted to think about, well, what will that person see when they're walking up to the mural, when they're walking up the stairs, when they're looking upward at the ceiling? And he's considering all those different viewpoints. Again, he's thinking about it as an architectural project, not just a painting project. And I think you can really tell that he's thinking about that because you can barely see where the edge of the wall is in these images, or where the ceiling begins and the wall stops. So he's trying to explode this space, make it look more expansive than it actually is, kind of break out of that cube. So previously, when we've looked at muralists, they've been focusing, oh, I'll just paint this one panel or this one panel. But he's seeing it as this whole environment, including the ceiling. Yeah, Gloria. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah, that there is this sense. It's a very overwhelming space to be in because there's things all around you. And another thing that he did, you'll notice there were windows right here on the stairway. He's actually made these panels go up over the windows. So he's integrated the windows even into the design and covered them up where they don't fit in the design. So he didn't want the windows to stand out like a sore thumb in this mural. So a really brilliant way of using the space. Any questions about? Okay. let's go back to this question. So now you've had a little taste of all three muralists. And I'm wondering, which muralist do you think follows the best revolutionary path? Is it Rivera, Orozco, or Siqueiros? Again, here's some of the murals from each of them that we talked about. Any thoughts on, I always do this as a debate with my students. And it's very interesting, they never all agree, that there's always some people in favor of Rivera, Orozco, and Siqueiros. So yeah, right here. Oh, and or a thought on this? Yeah.
It seems to me that they're each has its a different kind of focus or strength. Like Rivera is the idealist,
Yes.
Orozco the realist, and Siqueiros perhaps the technical modernist, most revolutionary artist. If
Yeah.
you're talking about technique,
About
is how I see it. It's hard not to love Rivera, even if he's stodgy.
Yes, thank you. Can I get your name too? Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. I think you summarized that really beautifully. Yeah, so you have to define, like, what do I think is revolutionary? Because yeah, if it's technique, then maybe it is Siqueiros. If it's about being optimistic about the future, then maybe you'd pick Rivera. If it's about being a realist or not shying away from the kind of negative aspects of the revolution, then it's Orozco. So, yeah, other thoughts? I saw you had your hand up. If you'll wait just a moment for the microphone.
My comment would be that they probably each developed with the other artists, that one wouldn't have developed the same way without the other two pushing and pulling and arguing and doing different things.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Thank you. Can I get your name?
Donna.
Thank you, Donna. Yeah, that we're kind of talking them as three separate artists because I wanted to show you how they're different. But you're right that no artist grows up in isolation or develops their style in isolation. They were aware of the other's work. And so they were trying to distinguish themselves from the other artists in addition to learning from them. So yeah, really good point, Donna. That they're all in community. They're also working with lots of other artists and thinking about their teachers, historical references. So yeah, they're in community. Yeah.
There's also a theme that underlines all three works, and that is the idea of human sacrifice. The Aztec woman or child who was sacrificed for the good of the community, for the positive development of society. So you could say that each of those themes is in some way embodied in the three murals.
Yeah,
Which is but it's an unresolved sacrifice. We don't know the end. We don't know the extent of whether it will be helpful, but the suffering is essential for the human life.
Yeah, thank you. And I think for Rivera, that sacrifice like will have a happy ending, or he does see it as working towards something better. Orozco says, no, there was a lot of violence and bloodshed, and that in itself might not have been worth it, or might not, that the kind of pain and suffering of the Mexican people and their bodies needs to be recognized too. Yeah, and Siqueiros, he is actually fighting back. So he is trying to sacrifice against this rise of fascism. One more comment on this, and then I want to show you a couple recent things.
Thank you. My name is Barbara.
Thanks,
I was introduced to Orozco back in my 20s on a trip to Guadalajara, and the travel book was talking about Orozco's murals in different buildings. And so we visited, saw all of those, and even visited his studio. So there is quite a bit of his work in Guadalajara. My impression at the time was that he was quite an intellectual. And also the guide who toured us through one of the buildings mentioned that he never left the country of Mexico, even though his murals portrayed the revolutions in Europe, fascism, a lot of different things as well. So if you, there is some of his work there. I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Barbara. I want to keep going because I do want to mention, I'll have some more time for questions. So if you have other questions or comments. Yeah, one more. Huh? Uh-huh.
Anita, hold on, wait.
Yes, I was just going to say that all three of them, their art is all about the people and what has happened, suffering and so forth. Whereas art in other parts of the world, Europe and America, maybe I'm talking about those two, is nature. A lot of, the Impressionists in the late 1800s and painting nature and the way that light hits people and nature. It's more about paint, maybe. This is all about people and what's happened to them and the revolution being such a absolutely monumental part of their lives. So,
Yeah, thank you, Anita. And one of the things that I will say is that even at the time, so in the 1930s here in the United States, this encouraged the WPA mural movement here in the US, which were murals about working people and the history of working people in the US. So we see that our own art history, even here in California, has been deeply influenced by this movement and the focus on the people, this social realism, that the working class, we deserve to have our stories told on government buildings and in artworks. And we also see the influence of Mexican muralism here in Sacramento with the work of the Royal Chicano Air Force, which I know we talked a little bit about on the tour. So this is a mural by the RCAF at the Washington Neighborhood Center called The Emergence of Chicano Social Struggle in a Bicultural Society. And the artists here were directly influenced by some of Orozco's style and also by the focus on working class struggles. So our Chicano muralist movement here in Sacramento is looking directly back to some of these three men that we talked about today. And I know for folks who are on the tour, I mentioned this, but there's going to be a major celebration of the Royal Chicano Air Force artists in spring of 2026. So there'll be an exhibition at the Crocker Art Museum of their prints. There'll be an exhibition here on campus about their murals. So we're really going to do a citywide celebration of these really important artists in Sacramento. And finally, if you want to learn more about Mexican art and actually see some of the murals that I looked at today, we see two of those murals that we looked at today and lots more. You can join me on my next study abroad trip to Mexico City. So I lead a trip every other summer to Mexico City. It's a 10-day intensive trip where we're going those 10 days because you get a semester worth of learning in a 10-day trip. So it's an exciting trip. If you're interested, it is open to community members. So I've had Renaissance Society members go on that trip before in the past. And you can also go with a friend, with a grandkid, with a relative. So if you know someone who'd be interested in a guided kind of excursion through Mexico City, feel free to email me and I can send you once we have the exact dates for summer 2025 and more info about that. So yes, it is a course. Yeah, so you pay the payment. It's a 3-credit class, and then it also includes all of the accommodations, many of the meals, all of the museum entrances. Yep. So, but it's through the College of Continuing Education, so anyone can enroll. So yes, you do have to take the class. You do have to do the homework. Sorry, it's not just a tour, but it is a great way to really dive into Mexican art. And the class is not that intense. It's an intro level class, so you don't have to have any knowledge of art to go on that. And in addition to murals, we also go see Frida Kahlo's Casa Azul and some of her work. We take an excursion to the pyramids at Teotihuacan. We go see Aztec art at the National Museum of Anthropology. We go visit contemporary artist studios to see what contemporary artists are thinking about and making in Mexico City, and lots more. So if you're interested, again, you can reach out to me about that.
Yes,
So,
I have a question. I think you're probably one of the most fascinating, engaging, knowledgeable professors I've had on any subject ever. And I'm wondering, yeah. And I'm wondering, are you teaching any classes in the fall? And if so, what and where? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's very kind of you. And teaching is my passion. So I'm glad that I'm happy to teach you all and anyone. Yes, so in the fall, I'm teaching actually a public art in the Americas class here on campus. And that meets every Wednesday morning. And that covers public art. We'll talk about Mexican muralism, but we'll talk about also sculptures and graffiti and Confederate monuments and performance art in public space. So a little bit of everything. And then I also teach a Latin American art class every semester. So that class is tough to get into. So I don't know if I could promise you a spot in that class. But that class is offered on Wednesday evenings as well. Any other? Yeah, and I teach lots of other classes, so you can always email me if you're like, oh, I want to take a class in the spring, and I could let you know. Hi, Wayne. Oh. Mhm. There we go.
You mentioned the Securos actually went to Spain to fight against Franco. I've just a thought experiment. If the other two artists had gone to Spain, they would also have been against Franco, but they would have been likely on opposite sides of Securos, because the communists has a civil war on the Republican side between the communists on one side and the Trotskyists and the anarchists on the other, and it kind of accelerated Franco's victory.
Yes, thank you, Wayne. And actually, one of the complications, so Siqueiros is a communist, but he is anti-Trotskyite. He's actually implicated in a plot to kill Trotsky when Trotsky is living in Mexico City. And Trotsky is eventually murdered, assassinated in Mexico City. Yeah, so, and Siqueiros is definitely very politically involved in Mexico as well, in kind of in these kind of battles. He actually goes to prison for being for some of his political actions here in Mexico, and he makes paintings from prison in Mexico City as well. Yeah, so very good point about the factions.
We have one comment in the Zoom.
Thank you, Chris.
It's a comment, not a question, but she says Orozco's Revolutionary Trinity showed the two lateral figures on their knees compared to Rivera's Trinity, who were standing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Whoever shared that on Zoom, thank you very much. Yeah, that's a big difference, that they're much less active when they're kneeling. They seem much less optimistic. That, again, it goes along with that idea that Orozco says, like, that the body of Mexico has been broken by all this violence of 10 years. So yeah, really good point. Thank you, whoever brought that up on Zoom, compared to the standing solid bodies that Rivera depicts. Other questions? I have some more slides I can show if we have the time, but yes, go ahead. Thank you again.
I know you mentioned that the Revolutionary Trinity harkens back to the Catholic Church. The Trinity, was that already popular symbolism? Was that already a popular symbol, or did Rivera create the Revolutionary Trinity in his work?
You stumped me. I don't know for sure if Rivera creates the Revolutionary Trinity. He's the one that of the three that does it first here, but I'm not sure if he creates it. Really good question. You stumped me. This is one of those questions that if I was in class, I would write it down and get back to you on it. So if I find more about that, I'll email someone here so they can share it with you. But I will say that this is a time where the Catholic Church and staunch Catholics in Mexico are actively fighting against the government. So it's this time called the Cristero Revolution in Mexico, because some Mexican Catholics are really upset that the Catholic Church is no longer so powerful after the revolution. So yeah, he's using these, or he's kind of showing the weakening of the Catholic Church and using Catholic ideas like the Trinity. But Catholicism is really a hot topic in Mexico at that time and really being fought about. And Rivera is a very staunch communist, so he is not a Catholic, but he's using these symbols because they're recognizable.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but, and it's kind of hard to see on these big screens, but are those priests in the bottom left that they're being sort of struck down?
Yes, so the other two figures, the figure in the kind of tan costume, he is supposed to represent the hacienda overseer who's overseeing the farm laborers or exploiting farm laborers, but the other two men, yeah, are supposed to represent the power of the church before the revolution and all the money that went to the Catholic Church.
Gloria?
Is it the same president through these three murals? No, it is not. So we have 1926, yeah, so these are different presidents. But actually Obregón, one of the early post-revolutionary presidents, is the person who commissions the Minister of Education to say, we need a new education plan for Mexico. And that education minister, Jose Vasconcelos, he's the one who says muralism is one of the things that we should sponsor. Because yeah, that was not something that the education department had sponsored previously. So yeah, it is one of the early presidents, Obregón, that gets this kind of idea of muralism rolling, but then the presidency has changed by the time these later pieces are made. Yeah, very good question.
Well, I have another question, and it's regarding payment. Can you say anything about how profitable it was for these guys?
Yeah, that's a good question. So many of these muralists are taking a lot of projects at the same time. So for example, Rivera, he takes this project at the National Palace, which we didn't look at today. It takes him years to complete that because he's also going off to the US and doing a mural there or painting for private patrons and then coming back to that mural. So they're usually commissioned for a flat fee, which doesn't encourage him to do it faster or things like that. As far as what he made, Rivera likes to talk about how he's making a working class salary. In actuality, he's making a lot more than a carpenter or a bricklayer would make at the time. So I don't have an exact number on any of these for what the contract would be, but that's a really good question. I'll have to look back in my notes, Chris, if I do know like exactly what the commission was for any of these.
I was just thinking overall whether, that was a field that was profitable for someone to do besides, you have a political, you're stating what you feel and you are like doing your art, but you got to make a living too. So, yeah.
Totally. And that's when they start to get in some of these debates because people say, oh, Rivera, you're selling out because you're doing this portrait of the wife of a wealthy US industrialist. But also, you have to make a living too. And that's relatively quick money for Rivera compared to doing a massive mural project like this. And Orozco, I mean, he does things like illustrations for a book about the Mexican Revolution that's published here in the US. So they're all thinking of, yeah, how can I make a living not just through murals? Because murals take a lot of time and energy. Good questions. Other questions here?
Hold on.
I just have a little question. For Porfirio Diaz, I don't know much Spanish. What does the Porfiriato, what does adding the ATO at the end mean? Thank you.
Means like that, yeah, good question. That's the era is the Porfiriato. So the Ato is like, that's the Porfirian era. Yeah, time frame. Yeah, good question, Kathy.
These muralists remind me so much. You mentioned the WPA paintings in San Francisco, particularly on the high schools and the front of the high schools in San Francisco during that time. They are so incredible. The stories that those murals tell in San Francisco. And I don't know how many people actually know that there are lots of them. So that, and Coit Tower.
Coit Tower was what I was going to mention. Yeah, the Coit Tower is kind of like, the US artists trying to do similar things, celebrate the working people of San Francisco in those Coit Tower murals, and very directly influenced by Rivera and the Mexican muralists there.
I have another question, and it's related to, and I can't remember the story, but wasn't it about Rivera painted a mural in New York and then it was not popular and was it Rockefeller?
Yes, I brought these slides because I thought someone might ask you. Very good question, Chris. Yeah, so one of the most famous Diego Rivera stories is that he commissioned a piece for Rockefeller Center in New York when Rockefeller Center was doing this major project with all kinds of different artists to decorate those new buildings. And yeah, Rivera was one of the most famous artists in the world at the time. He had a solo show at the MoMA in the 1930s. So he was selected by the Rockefellers to do this commission. And this is as far as he got. So this is the documentation that we have of that mural. And people started to get upset, or the Rockefellers started to get upset about the mural because it showed Rockefeller here and the rich people as this kind of excess, these over-the-top kind of spenders drinking their martinis and celebrating, where the working class and Lenin specifically are on the other side. So we have these kind of two poles, and you get a sense of what side Rivera is on. Here, he's on the side of the workers. Now, the Rockefellers had to know that this is the kind of politics they were going to get if they asked Rivera. So some people have said, you know, maybe they wanted the publicity and kind of that they knew that Rivera might push back against them and they accepted that risk, but they weren't willing to go this far. So one of the things that they didn't like about the mural is that Rockefeller here, this portrait, he's right next to, these are all microbes. You can see it a little better in the recreated version. Sorry, here. So here's the microbes, and he's right next to the bacteria that causes syphilis. So again, showing all of these, whoops, sorry. These are all microbes representing diseases, and they're next to the wealthy figures. So, whoops. Sorry, I'll go back here. So this is as far as he got before Rockefeller pulled the plug, whoops, on the project, covered it up for a while, and then eventually they chipped it off the wall. So this is a fresco. It was on the wall in hardened plaster. They chipped it off the wall, and they actually had the Spanish artist, Josep Maria Sert, paint a new mural in that location. So if you go to Rockefeller Center now, you'll see Josep Sert's mural in the place where Rivera's mural originally was. But then the Mexican government gets an amazing opportunity to say, we are more open-minded than those US capitalists. We will have you repaint that mural in the National Palace of Fine Arts. So if you come with me to Mexico City, we go to the Bellas Artes, or the Palace of Fine Arts, where you can see a recreation of that design. Obviously not exactly the same, it's a different shape, but the same basic design realized in full in Mexico City, where it could not be under Rockefeller's watch. Going back to Chris's question about payment, I do know that Rivera still got some of the payment from Rockefeller for that mural, even though it was destroyed. Yeah, so very good question, Chris.
So Mya, one of the things that I wondered about, because this was all social realism and it looks so much like Soviet art. It reminds me so much of that. And about this time, it seemed like the US was reacting against this because we were so thoroughly anti-communist. And was there any truth to the idea that then the US started supporting contemporary art, modern art, as a way of counteracting this movement?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, Deborah. So you're absolutely right in seeing the Soviet parallels here. In fact, Rivera visits the Soviet Union and is inspired by what he sees in Soviet art. So yeah, you see here, like even just these images of all the women with their red headscarves looks very much like Soviet art from the 19-teens, 1920s. Yes, and like even here where you have Soviet heroes like Lenin and here you see like the banner, you see images and other pieces of Karl Marx. So he's definitely celebrating those Soviet and communist heroes here. This was at a time when the Communist Party, both in the US and in Mexico, this is before the Cold War, so the party was seen as a more legitimate, if a very far left political party. Yeah, so that's kind of how he's able to get away with this at that time. Obviously, after the Cold War, this would not have flown in Mexico or in the US. But then this kind of dominance of realist art and of working class art in the US did lead to pushback. So Jackson Pollock starts out by doing regionalist images. Some of Jackson Pollock's first paintings are like of a Conestoga wagon, and which you don't usually see. But then he starts to push back against that because that was the dominant style that was taught. So then he starts to do more abstract art. And then during the Cold War, the US government starts to send abstract art abroad to say that in the US, we support artistic freedom. Artists can do whatever they want, even these kind of wild abstract things. So it's abstract art is actually used to push back against Soviet and communist ideas by the US government in the Cold War. Yeah, really good question, Deborah. Other questions? Oops. There's a few more minutes for questions, or I can show you some more art. I have some hidden art here. Okay, we'll go to the hidden art here. So a kind of postlude to Mexican muralism in Mexico City is how artists have used Mexican muralism and the power of Mexican muralism to fight back against the government more recently. So this is art by the collective called Tepito Arte Acá. Tepito is a neighborhood in Mexico City that's known as a very working class neighborhood, a very can be kind of an unsafe neighborhood for tourists. And it's also a neighborhood that has a very long tradition and identity related to ambulant vending and some of the markets in Tepito. And this group of artists in Tepito, so this is some of images of that neighborhood. It says Viva Tepito, or long live the neighborhood of Tepito. But in 1972, there was this plan from the Mexico City government called Plan Tepito to basically gentrify this neighborhood, to bulldoze a lot of these historic houses and these community spaces and redevelop the neighborhood because it's right in the center of Mexico City. And the community wanted to push back against that. They said, this is our neighborhood, this is our culture, we've lived here for generations. And what they do is they start to put up murals everywhere in the neighborhood. Because all murals in Mexico are protected national patrimony. You can't destroy a mural. So this is, I'm glad we got to the bonus slides, because this is like the one photograph of the three muralists together. Notice they don't look super buddy-buddy here, but this is at the creation of the National Mural Commission. So it's this idea that the Mexican government says, yes, murals are Mexican, murals need to be protected. And then in the 1970s, those artists in Tepito say, ooh, we can use that to our advantage. So murals actually become this kind of cultural strategy, this way to protect the culture of the neighborhood and kind of use the government value of murals against this government plan. So you see that there's all these amazing murals going up in people's yards, where people are hanging their laundry or doing their cooking, as part of this way to save those structures and save that neighborhood. So I think that's a really interesting postscript on muralism in Mexico. And muralism actually becomes the dominant form in Mexico, so much that artists start to rebel by pushing back and doing artwork on canvas. Yeah, because of that. Yeah, so that kind of goes back to Deborah's question about abstract art. Some of these murals are also more abstract because They don't want to just do the same things that the Mexican muralists.
Maya,
then I think
have you
36.
seen the ones in Medellin in the some?
No, I have not.
Oh, okay. We'll talk about that later.
Uh-huh.
Hi, I'm interested in the intersection between murals and graffiti. So would graffiti also be protected, and who would define the difference between a mural and graffiti?
Yeah, really good question. That's a big question that we talk about in my public art class. We actually read through like what are graffiti ordinances and how do cities define graffiti? So yeah, these would not be considered graffiti. Graffiti is often defined as using spray paint, and it's often defined as like tagging, so it has text as the main element. Yeah, and graffiti is not protected in Mexico City. So graffiti, in fact, you see graffiti painted over very quickly by the city. So yeah, it's interesting that they're valuing this one art form of murals, but if you cross the line into graffiti, then it's going to be painted over. Yeah. No, these are just like acrylic paint on the building. Yep, so not in the plaster. The ones, yeah, all of these are just on the building surface. Yeah, less permanent, unfortunately, but yeah.
Have you ever been to Valparaiso?
I
Yeah.
have, yes. Valparaiso is in a coastal city in Chile that is known for, just as you look up the hills, there's just incredible colors of the murals all up the hillsides. Yeah, really. Chile has another amazing mural history from the time of Allende and also during the military dictatorship in Chile. Yeah, so really interesting mural history there, inspired by Mexican muralism as well. Any other questions? I know we need to wrap up soon here. Yes.
Oh, wait.
Oh, yeah. And can I get
I'll
your
bring the
name
mic
again,
back.
too? Thank you, Kathy.
I know you mentioned in Mexico that murals are seen as like artwork for the people, but in one of your slides it showed that murals are also considered patrimony. Do you have any thoughts on what that means?
Yeah. Yeah. So national patrimony, basically that idea is that it's culture that's for all the Mexican people, but it's protected by the government. So yeah, they're basically saying that murals are part of Mexico's cultural history, and therefore they should be protected. Yeah, so it's not that same idea of like patrimony in that way. Yeah, so it's a different, I mean, it's similar in that it's the idea that it's like the father culture of Mexico. But yeah, national patrimony means that it's artwork that is uniquely Mexican and therefore needs to be protected by the government. Yeah, really good question. Any other questions? All right. Thank you all so much. You had such wonderful questions. I really appreciate it. It's a joy to work with you all.
Maya, I don't think I could have said it any better than Kathy, but this is so engaging, so wonderful, so magnificent. And thank you for doing this for us. And thank you for the art walk this morning. And we would like to recognize your efforts by giving you an honorary membership in Renaissance Society, as well as making a donation in your name for the Student Emergency Cares Fund.
Thank you
Seth
so much.
Nelson
That
Fund.
means a lot.
So we really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.